Hello. Oh, there we go. Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Public Programs Director of YIVO, and we're so pleased to have you here with us, both in person and online, for today's talk, Yiddish Pills and Summer Thrills, Reconstituting Yiddishism at Camp Hemshekh with Sandra Fox. This talk, which we thank an anonymous donor for making possible, is the second in a series of programs held in conjunction with YIVO's current digitization project to digitize the Jewish labor and political archives here at YIVO, or the JLPA, consisting of nearly 200 collections encompassing 3.5 million pages of archival documents that were collected by the Bund Archives, that is. The JLPA forms the world's most comprehensive body of material pertaining to Jewish political activity in Europe and the United States. So we're undertaking this big initiative to digitize this material, and we're celebrating it with these annual lectures, of which this is the second annual lecture. Sandra Fox is the Robert S. Rifkin Chair in American Jewish History at the Jewish Theological Seminary. She was previously a Goldstein-Gorn visiting assistant professor of American Jewish History at New York University and the director of the Archive of the American Jewish Left in the Digital Age. Her research interests include American Jewish history, the history of youth and childhood, Yiddish culture, and the history of sexuality. Her book, The Jews of Summer, Summer Camp and Jewish Culture in Post-War America, addresses the experiences of youth in post-war Jewish summer camps and the place of intergenerational negotiation in the making of American Jewish culture. This is a book which we have for sale in the lobby here today if you haven't read it, and if you're watching online, you can purchase this book at YIVO's online store. And so, needless to say, Camp Hemshekh and material about Camp Hemshekh are included in these Jewish labor and political archives here at YIVO. So we're really pleased to have this lecture bringing to life some of the stories that our collections tell. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sandra Fox.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Raise your hand if you went to Camp Hemshekh. I'm just curious. Okay, most of you. That's great. So then I get to be honest for the first, I've given so many talks on this research about Jewish summer camps in general, not just about Hemshekh. So I get to be honest for the first time, your camp was my favorite camp. So congratulations. Yeah. I looked at a lot of archives. I came to really love Hemshekh, at least as a historian and observer of the camp. And that's one of the reasons I wrote a lot about it, but actually the bigger reason is because it's sort of the anomaly that shines a light on the whole of the camping sector, which I'll draw on a little bit today. I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. So I'll get started. In the late 1960s, a group of campers at Camp Hemshekh, a Yiddish cultural sleepaway camp in upstate New York, took a field trip to see a local theater production of Fiddler on the Roof. At Hemshekh, campers used Yiddish words on a daily basis in the camp environment, immersed themselves in the literature and history of Ashkenazi Jewry, and commemorated the recent Holocaust through celebrating and emulating the Yiddish-speaking culture that thrived in the past. To one counselor named Joe, watching Fiddler that day evoked a surprising feeling, less like watching a fictionalized depiction of the past than an expression of life at Camp Hemshekh itself, causing the campers to feel, quote, very much like the chosen people. As the group watched the play, and also watched the audience watch the play, they felt, quote, almost as though they were in on a very special secret. After the campers ended the night of performances by singing Yiddish songs to an audience of vacationing middle-class Jews from the city, Joe experienced a quote-unquote inescapable feeling of authenticity. Drawing a clear line of distinction between the audience, for whom Fiddler reflected a nostalgic, distant past, and the Hemshekh campers and counselors who saw themselves as active defenders of and participants in the culture on stage, Joe distinguished camp life and the kinds of Jews campers became through it from mainstream American Jewish culture, detached from its cultural inheritance and from real Jewishness as she understood it. Placing Yiddishism, a 19th century Jewish linguistic nationalism, and Bundism, a Jewish form of socialism, at the center of its mission, the leaders of Camp Hemshekh operated on a very different political wavelength from the vast majority of American Jews at that time. In the years following mass immigration, when millions of Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews arrived on American shores, Yiddish rose to hold a place of great import in American Jewish culture, with Yiddish theaters, films, book publishers, newspapers, labor movements, schools, and fraternal organizations growing in number and prominence. During this boom period of Yiddish culture at the early 20th century, Yiddishist ideologue and educator Chaim Zhelosky predicted that the future of Jewish national and cultural existence in America would center on the Yiddish language, with schools and universities functioning as the crown of Yiddish culture. Despite Zhelosky's rosy projections, however, Yiddish declined in use as immigrants and their children came to learn English. Its decline hastened after the Immigration Act of 1924, which ended the flow of Yiddish speakers into American cities. Part of an emergent middle class, Jews of the post-war period left Jewish urban neighborhoods in droves, where synagogues became the centers of communal life in suburbia. These massive socioeconomic changes, alongside the ethos of the Cold War, transformed the secularism, socialism, and overall leftism associated with Yiddishist sentiments into a liability. Some Yiddish schools still operated past the 1950s, but they experienced a steep decline in students. The murder of millions of Yiddish speakers in the Holocaust and the systematic repression of the Yiddish language in the Soviet Union and the Yishuv and later Israel also threatened Yiddish on a global scale. A handful of organizations, including those who sponsored summer camps, continued to promote Yiddish education and cultural production, but a small minority of Jews ultimately took dedicated steps to preserve and produce Yiddish culture. So by the 1960s, when those campers at Hemshekh went to go see Fiddler, Yiddish had not only ceased to be an everyday vernacular among most American Jews, most Jews had actually consciously worked to disentangle themselves from the kinds of socialism and the kind of ideologies that Hemshekh promoted in response to the intense scrutiny faced under McCarthyism. But while Yiddish-oriented camps struggled to keep themselves sufficiently Yiddish-speaking in the decades following World War II, and at times struggled with finding enough campers, they did not disappear, not immediately anyway. Yiddishists, who I personally define as people who dedicated their efforts to the future of Yiddish culture and speech, not only set the groundwork for the Jewish educational camping sector to take off in the early 20th century, but would participate in the wider post-World War II phenomenon that led Jewish summer camp to become a central part of American Jewish culture and education. And yet, despite playing these vital roles, Yiddishists are often left out of the story of Jewish camping, education, and identity building in America after World War II. So today I'm going to put the Yiddish camps back in the picture, focusing mostly on Camp Hemshekh, but also mentioning Camp Boybrik quite a bit because they're relevant to each other, describing their role in the larger history of Jewish summer camping and in post-war American Jewish life. So my book focuses on two Yiddishist camps in particular. Camp Boybrik, founded in 1923 by the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute, a Yiddish folk shul, a day school in New York, and Camp Hemshekh, founded in 1959. Both of these camps hold their records at YIVO, so I did a lot of research in this very building. And while I'll be talking about Hemshekh for most of this lecture, the broader context of Yiddish camping is really required in order to understand what made Hemshekh unique. So I'm going to talk about Boybrik in order to draw out what it says about Hemshekh, and a little bit vice versa. My focus on Hemshekh and Boybrik is largely due to source availability. There are other Yiddish camps, but Hemshekh and Boybrik had the best archives available. The other Yiddish camps that are mentioned in my book are Kindering, Kinderland, and Kinderwelt, but in depth, it's mostly Boybrik and Hemshekh. I would also say that one thing that makes Boybrik and Hemshekh unique from those other camps is that they were definitely more Yiddish-focused than those other camps from the get-go, and would remain much more committed to the cause of Yiddishism in the face of Yiddish linguistic decline. The leaders of Hemshekh and Boybrook embraced the concept of sleepaway camping as a potential cure for cultural decline in ways that, as I will explain tonight, are actually very similar to Jews of other ideological and religious stripes. Looking at Yiddish camps, then, has a way of adding a new layer of understanding to the study of more mainstream camps. Let's say, the Ramah summer camps or Zionist summer camps, which get a lot more play in kind of the Jewish public conversation around camping. But Yiddish camps are not only an example of a more marginal topic that lets us understand something new about the bigger or more important topics out there. Yiddish camps show that Jews used camps to pass over other ideologies than Zionism, right? It wasn't just about Zionism or about Judaism in terms of a religion. And that is actually fascinating in and of itself when you trace the broader trajectory of Jewish education. I've taught to many, contemporary Jewish educators today, and they find it really interesting to think about the fact that camps used to offer a much wider range of kind of Jewish symbolic or ideological frameworks for kids to find their Jewish identities within. But Yiddish camps also show that Yiddishism itself did not disappear in the post-war period. Rather, it went through a process of transformation to fit a new situation, a time in which Yiddish could no longer be considered a vernacular of American Jewry. That transformation did not happen in mainstream Jewish spaces. No major Jewish organizations, synagogues, or American Jewish press outlets seemed to be very involved or even aware. In summer camps, however, leaders were forced to get creative with their work with youth. And the results of that creativity and intergenerational negotiation allowed Yiddishism to survive and, in ways, thrive through the current day. So this is also the story I want to tell today, how Yiddish camps, and in particular Camp Hemshekh, transformed Yiddishism from a nationalist linguistic ideology into a tool towards forming an American Jewish identity. So, to understand this evolution, it's important to understand where American Jewish summer camps more generally came from, and when Yiddishists actually began to take part in this wider phenomenon. So this history starts in the Progressive Era, when Jews, alongside fresh air reformers, the Boy Scouts of America, settlement house organizations, and Christian congregations, began to build residential summer camps for children. Providing a reprieve from what progressives saw as the negative impacts of urban life on immigrant children, philanthropic Jewish camps offered recreation in nature with the comfort of socializing with one's own fellow Jews. Private camps for middle-class Jewish children, on the other hand, offered opportunities for families denied entry to Christian-majority camps. In the 1920s, a small number of new camps built by Hebraist, Yiddish-focused, Zionist, and Jewish educational organizations were established, incorporating some elements of Jewish study, leadership training, and language learning. But even as Yiddish organizations began to build camps in the 1920s, they were primarily escapes from the city for the children who went to Yiddish supplementary schools or were the children of labor movement members. Campers and staff spoke Yiddish at camp in the 20s because it was one of their everyday languages, but they also mixed it freely with English. They sang Yiddish songs, but also patriotic and popular English songs. In an industry focused on recreation, immersion in nature, socialization, and Americanization, camps with intensely Jewish missions were originally on the margins of the Jewish camping sector, and Yiddish camps at that time period reflected this. They were only marginally focused on Jewish or Yiddish education as a goal. This began to change in the years between the two world wars, but took off primarily in the aftermath of the Holocaust, when Jews experienced new socioeconomic conditions here in America, and along with them, new anxieties about the Jewish future. While American Jews had steadily begun their climb into middle-classness prior to World War II, Jewish soldiers returning home from the war found themselves catapulted into middle-class comfort, benefiting from housing loans and educational scholarships offered to white veterans. As they moved from cities to suburbs, the synagogue center, with its sisterhoods, men's clubs, and other social offerings, provided new Jewish suburbanites official and tangible ways to affiliate with Judaism, replacing the informal, neighborhood-based affiliations of urban communities of earlier in the century. Mirroring middle-class America's mounting focus on the child during the baby boom, furthermore, children and adolescents became the center of Jewish communal priorities. Coinciding with what many have described as a golden age of American Judaism, a time marked by social mobility, affluence, and suburbanization, the development of what Herbert Gans coined child-centered Judaism, the period saw the dramatic growth of synagogue Hebrew schools, nursery schools, youth groups, and yes, summer camps. Growing affluence and rising social status clearly afforded American Jews great benefits. As they climbed the educational and professional ladder, most Jews happily embraced their new standing and the material and psychological comforts that came with it. The sizable and attractive synagogue buildings and Jewish community centers that Jews built reflected their comfort in post-war suburbia and their plans to stay there for the long haul. At the same time, these dramatic socioeconomic transitions also provoked deep anxiety among communal leaders. Many Jews felt ambivalent about their socioeconomic ascent, worrying that Jewish cultural authenticity would not survive the comfort of affluence. Rather than celebrating their new place in American society, educators, rabbis, and lay leaders projected these concerns onto youth and their parents in particular, citing a growing need to develop Jewish identity in children. Having never experienced for themselves life in Jewish urban ghettos, let alone life in Eastern European shtetl, a diverse onslaught of American Jews worried that the younger generation would not come to understand real Jewishness, as they called it, on their own. Without intervention, they argued, authentic Jewish culture would disappear altogether. The full realizations of the Holocaust's devastation added a level of urgency to the distress they felt about the state of post-war Jewishness. Without European Jewry to look to, and with Israel's future uncertain, post-war American Jewish leaders saw themselves as responsible for carrying Judaism and Jewish culture forward into the future. For many Jewish educators, producing educational, immersive, and affective Jewish camp experiences in the Holocaust aftermath was a matter of cultural life or death, of continuity or discontinuity. The affluence at the heart of their concerns about authenticity ironically proved essential, though, in the Jewish camping sector's ability to flourish and start kind of thriving in that period. Post-war Jews had more resources to put towards their children's education and recreation and the enjoyment of their own child-free summers. The more that families could afford to send children to camp, the more that the yearly migration of the young from Jewish urban neighborhoods and suburbs to the American countryside became a distinguishing element of Jewish middle-classness and, for thousands of young Jews, a rite of passage. This sunny economic picture also meant that Jewish movements and institutions had the ability to purchase acres of land where they built modern, comfortable, and permanent campsites, and they could also provide scholarships for families who could not afford camp without assistance. So, what I mean by modern is, in the early 20th century, many summer camps were taking place at relatively kind of empty tracts of land, impermanent structures. Camp programs might have existed for a couple of years and then disappeared, or they would switch locations frequently. In the post-war period, more wealth in the Jewish community means you can build, more kind of stable and lasting summer camps with all these kind of modern amenities, right? So nice bunks and basketball courts, a lakefront, etc. I'm not necessarily talking about Hemshekh. I hear people being like, no, Hemshekh wasn't nice or something like that. I understand. My camp wasn't nice either. Okay. So the Jewish summer camp thus offers a unique lens for examining tensions between the post-war period's goldenness and this ambivalence that Jews felt about the goldenness. Rather than sitting in contradiction, affluence, comfort, and anxiety fed off of each other, pushing Jewish culture and communal life into new directions. The educational or ideological summer camp was one such direction. The dazzling homogeneity of camp structures and methods over the course of the post-war period, revealing their leaders' underlying shared hopes and dreams. that camp could counteract the downsides of the present, propelling positive, real, or authentic Jewishness forward into the future. So camps affiliated with Zionist movements, the conservative reform movements of Judaism, and organizations affiliated with Yiddish culture were by far the most emblematic of the post-war trends I've discussed so far. These camp types did not encapsulate all of the Jewish camps of the period. You've probably heard of other kinds of Jewish camps, right? Ones that were sponsored by the YMHAs, Federation camps, or what we think of as Federation today. But most of those camps were primarily recreational and just included a tiny bit of cultural religious practice into their programs. There were also a lot of private summer camps owned by Jewish families where people might observe Shabbat and do a little bit of Jewish practice, but very, very little. From the 1940s through the 1960s, however, Zionist, Yiddishist, Reform, and conservative camps stood out in the degree to which religious, political, and linguistic ideologies shaped the details of everyday life at camp and how much energy their leaders invested in inculcating youth with Jewish beliefs, practices, cultural touchstones, and political attitudes. So these camps had divergent ideologies, to be sure, and you probably weren't expecting to hear anything about Zionist camps today, but I think it's really important to draw this kind of distinction and comparison because it's really fascinating, right? What's interesting at looking at them together, though, rather than seeing them as too unique to even be compared, is that they actually used extremely similar methods of producing what they considered to be ideal or authentic Jewishness within camps. For camp leaders, Jewish authenticity was always located somewhere else, in other historical periods and other cultures. It could not be fostered in American suburbia. So take, for example, maybe you're familiar with Lavish Lehrer. Lehrer was a prominent leader in Yiddish education who founded and directed Camp Boybrik for the purpose of educating the students of the Shalom Aleichem Folkschule during the summer months. In a 1959 essay, Lehrer explained, "Those who have ever been under the sway of authentic Jewish tradition must have felt the disparity of some basic elements of Jewish and American culture, a disparity which has led to interminable conflicts between the older and younger generations." So that's Lehrer. Here we have a quote from Rabbi David Maligner, an important Ramah leader. He echoed really similar ideas in a late 1960s text regarding Jewish education. He believed that camps, at their best, should, quote, serve American Jewry by providing creative, imaginative, and positive programs, which will strengthen Jewish life here and assure its continuity under optimum conditions, end quote. While each camp had its own ideologically imbued vision of authenticity, Maligner used Israel and Jewish practice as his kind of guide, while Lehrer used Yiddish culture as his. These leaders actually shared a core belief that authentic Jewishness would not naturally occur in the American environment. Rather, it had to be fabricated. And they believed that sleepaway camps proved the ideal atmosphere for producing this sense of real Jewishness. Due to their immersive 24/7 quality. Educators like Lehrer and Maligner structured their camps as simulations of perceived lifestyles of Jews, such as Zionist pioneers and soldiers, Warsaw Ghetto resistance fighters, Yiddish-speaking socialists and writers, all untainted by comfortable, affluent suburbia. The fantasy that camps had unparalleled power to mold children deeply informed the structure of camps programs. So, despite their ideological differences, the leaders of Jewish summer camps of all kinds shared a central hope about the power of Jewish camping. And if you read the Jewish press around May, June, that power of Jewish camping idea is still very, very much alive and well in the American Jewish community today. And that basically, like the power idea that people hold is the idea that immersing children in a Jewish lifestyle for 1 or 2 months of the summer yields a more authentically Jewish generation, curbing the decline of Jewish culture as educators understand it. So this is one of my book's core arguments, that how these ideas about camp's power to transform youth actually shaped camp life at a very everyday level. So now I want to pivot to thinking about how this played out at Hemshekh primarily, and to some extent also Camp Boybrik, again, to draw that kind of comparison. I want to think about with you what role Yiddish what the leaders thought the role of Yiddish should be in camp, and how campers reacted to their plans and visions. So there are a lot of different ways that Yiddish culture appeared in daily life at camp, but today I want to focus on these primary ways. So the organization of time at camp, their daily, weekly, and monthly schedules. That's kind of the first inherent way that camps give over their ideology, is making sure that every aspect of the day, the week, the month is kind of geared towards their broader goals. We're going to think about play, both role-playing games or what were sometimes called sociodramas, special pageants that camps would hold, and also color war. Holocaust morning or Tisha B'Av at Camp Hemshekh, Ghetto Day, Yiddish speech, the kind of way that Yiddish was infused into the camp environment, and different kinds of Yiddish cultural education. And finally, democratic education, leniency, and freedom, also including romantic and sexual freedom. So let's start with time. Okay. At the most basic level, leaders organized time at camp to simulate the lifestyles of Jews from other times and places. Through the content and overall flow of camp's daily, weekly, and monthly schedules, camp leaders projected and enacted their fantasies on campers, inflecting every hour with their specific visions of ideal Jewishness. So, since so many of you were at camp, can someone talk me through a regular day, briefly, at Camp Hemshekh? Like, what do you remember? Alish off. What happened then? You didn't want to get up. Okay, so you wake up in the morning, right? Maybe you, at some of the camps I found, did you do this at Hemshekh ever, like kind of calisthenics in the morning? Every morning, right? Even the calisthenics has an ideology too, right? It harkens actually to like socialist ideas around the body. Only the socialist and communist summer camps included calisthenics. Interesting. Okay, flag racing.
We also had a buffalo hunt where we had to clean up the premises. Yes. All the candy wrappers from the night before. So that was a way of keeping the camp clean without using staff.
Okay, so you kept the camp clean. That's a big part of camp life, right? You're kind of doing some labor. You're creating, it's part of the democracy element also, right? Like you're part of the creating of the camp environment. Great. You would have some sort of educational activity, right? Yiddish or Lernschuh? Okay, not necessarily 10:30 in the morning. The schedules change over time. You've got some sort of work, lunch, some sports in the afternoon, I have to imagine, maybe in the morning also. So what's interesting is that this schedule looks very similar to the schedules of other kinds of Jewish camp, but it's infused ever so slightly with that Yiddishism at each moment of the day, even in places where you wouldn't necessarily imagine it was there. For instance, like I said, calisthenics, it's not just the notion of keeping your body healthy. Only the camps that were affiliated with something socialist or communist actually did calisthenics, and there's something related to the ideology there. Okay, so that's a little bit about time. We can talk a little bit more about time later, yeah. Okay. So I wanted to bring up play and role play. So from the beginning of American summer camping, progressive educational philosophies underpinned the enterprise, with camp leaders arguing that play and recreation proved vital to social development and education. Jewish educators of the early 20th century adopted these ideas too, aided by the heavily Jewish professions of social work and social science. However, the games that they had campers play took on new forms and new purposes in the post-war decades. Through role-playing games and through what many social workers called sociodrama, various forms of play at camp worked to make the simulation of Jewish lifestyles apparent in the daily schedules all the more direct. Orchestrated and curated by directors and educators influenced by Jewish social science, campers took on the roles of historical and contemporary Jews from other parts of the world through imaginative and performative play. At Hemshekh and Boyberick, role play reflected their ideologies and their visions of history. So, I don't know where this image went, I'm sorry everyone, but Boyberick, has anyone heard about the Felker Yontif? Yeah, so Boyberick had this really famous thing called Felker. For those who don't know about it, I never saw an example of it pretty much at any other camp. It was a festival of the nations, and different groups of campers would be assigned different nation groups to represent with costume, song, and dance. And it was this beautiful vision of a kind of cosmopolitan worldview that really reflected the camp's ideology. So that's something that they had. Camp Hemshekh, I love this because people at home, everyone's just calling out who's in the photos. In case you're wondering, if I look distracted, it's because I am a little distracted. It's okay, we're having fun here. Right, so at Camp Hemshekh, I found a lot of images of campers dressed up like Jews from the past. So in this image, what are we seeing here? What are the campers dressed up as? You think they look Hasidic, I'm hearing? No?
He looks like a beggar, kind of like a wandering Jew.
A wandering Jew, perhaps? What I love about the images I found is that I don't always have clear answers. We have to kind of interpret it, right? But certainly these characters they're dressed up as, they're not, what are they not? They're not right, they're not American Jewish youth. Yes, the Yada, yes. Mm-hmm.
It had Yom Tovim.
Mm-hmm.
It had Alphabet and Schreiber, different authors.
Yep.
So that is not typical of.
I'm just getting to color war, actually. Great. So this whole notion of play, right, and the way that it can also serve an ideological goal, also applied to color war. Color war, I should say, is this broader American camping tradition, a day or a set of days in which campers were broken up into teams, usually divided by colors like red, green, blue, and competing in different kinds of activities. So while mostly about fun, teamwork, and sportsmanship, even these days drew inspiration from the ideologies of their camps. Like camps that were Zionist, they would often, break up into different teams that had to do with different areas in Israel, for instance. But at Camp Hemshekh, how did you break up the teams? What were the teams representing? Writers, Yiddish writers. So, right, here's an example from Team Red, the Yud Lamed Peretz team. So these are all examples, right, of the ways that play can be harnessed to give over different ideologies. And Hemshekh did it in a very particular way, but within the framework of all these camps, you can see the ways that play could be used for all different kinds of ideological educational purposes. In a markedly, I don't know where these images went. Sorry, everyone. This image would be, if it was here, an image of the Denkmal, yeah. The Denkmal. I think specifically the one that was the mosaic one. The mosaic one, exactly. So in a markedly less fun and recreational note, camps use the Jewish holy day of Tisha B'Av, obviously not Hemshekh, I'll get there in a second, but most camps use Tisha B'Av, the only Jewish holy day to fall during the summer months, as the main moment for marking the Holocaust alongside a host of other Jewish tragedies, while avowedly secular camps like Hemshekh created their own alternatives to it. Their differing political and religious standpoints infused the days with different messages and goals, but their camp-wide programs proved remarkably similar, actually, in tone and order. All different kinds of Jewish camps use stories of Jewish heroism as counterbalances for the sadness of the day. But rather than looking towards Israel for its main inspiration, Yiddish camps looked towards Warsaw Ghetto resistance fighters. Addressing the Holocaust, educators came to believe, functioned as a particularly powerful tool in their efforts to change Jewish culture through the next generation, not only because it offered a chance to underscore the relevance of their camp's nationalist, religious, and linguistic ideologies, but because campers sourced deep commitments to their Jewishness through stories of Jewish suffering. At Hemshekh, as many of you in the audience, of course, know firsthand, this was much less theoretical than it was at other camps. More kids at Camp Hemshekh were children of Holocaust survivors than on the average, right? And so the day could also be, at the first time of camp, maybe the first time they came to learn of the horrors their families had gone through during the Holocaust, maybe kind of from a different perspective. So like I said, at Hemshekh, camp did not mark Tisha B'Av, the religious holy day, but rather created a special day called Ghetto Day. Sorry, I don't have an image of it, everyone. I'm so sorry. Hemshekh's invented 24-hour Memorial Day included elements that are kind of remarkably similar to camp's Tisha B'Av practices, but also a little different. Ghetto Night fostered an emotion-probing experience for campers through scripted recollections of the Holocaust, candlelit spaces, and somber song. For the children of survivors, Ghetto Night proved particularly emotional, as many campers learned of what their parents went through in detail. And as at other camps, the program was also a tribute to the resistance, allowing campers to, quote, think of Jews in the ghettos and... Oh, weird. Okay, there we go. Allowing campers to, quote, think of Jews in the ghettos and camps as heroes rather than victims, in control, brave, and strong. Ghetto Day, moreover, not only functioned as a moment of commemoration and mourning, but as an opportunity to emphasize the camp's ideological cause, imploring children to not let Yiddish die with the 6 million. Okay, so what of the role of Yiddish itself at camp? How much Yiddish did campers speak? The everyday role of Yiddish at camp itself was a moving target. And I'm talking beyond Hemshekh here. When I think about camps starting in the 1920s through the 1970s, it's a changing situation as the situation of Yiddish changed in America. As I mentioned earlier, when campers went to camps in the 20s and 30s, most spoke Yiddish from home, and thus learning Yiddish was less of a goal than it would be later on. But as Yiddish declined as an everyday vernacular outside of camp, camps had to be intentional about Yiddish learning and Yiddish cultural programming. At Boyberick, English songs stopped being printed in the camp's songbook by the 1960s. This is super fascinating to me. Boyberick had a lot of English songs in its songbooks, and then there was clearly a decision made to stop doing that, to kind of make the camp more Yiddishist in the face of Yiddish decline. And Hebrew classes were also originally offered at Camp Boyberick. They were also dropped by, I think, around the 50s. Maintaining Yiddish words in the everyday environment and kind of vernacular of camp by naming sites around camp, as you can see here in this drawn map, group names and periods on the daily and monthly schedule, was something that all kinds of Yiddish camps did, and something that they would continue to do even as campers arrived speaking less and less Yiddish from the home. By labeling camp time, groups, and physical spaces in Yiddish, camp educators believed that campers would not only acquire a new vocabulary through something like osmosis, but would also come to see Yiddish as inextricable aspects of the Jewishness they acquired through their time spent at camp. While in the 1940s and 1950s at Boyberick, educators and counselors still attempted to teach Yiddish formally during the camp's education hour, teaching Yiddish toward any level of proficiency proved exceedingly difficult. In day-to-day life, Hemshekh also would struggle with similar language issues, as did kind of Boyberick and also even the Hebrew-centered camps that we think of today, like the Ramah camps, Hebraeus Camp Masad, etc. In day-to-day camp life, campers often struggled to express themselves in Yiddish or Hebrew if they were at a Hebrew-speaking camp, and compounding different kinds of pedagogical challenges were also just social ones. The fact that youth did not enthusiastically embrace and even sometimes actively resisted the language plans or hopes and dreams of their elders. Hemshekh's leaders often expressed disappointment over their apparent failures, mourning the impossibility of making camps more Yiddish-speaking in the post-war moment. But while educators knew that their symbolic engagements with Yiddish would not save the language per se, camp leaders saw language maintenance, however limited, as integral to cultural maintenance. Fighting tirelessly against linguistic trends, they embedded camp life with Yiddish vocabulary, performance, song, and some learning to achieve their goals. Camp's use of language could not save Yiddish from decline, just as more mainstream camps would not make Hebrew a kind of spoken everyday vernacular among American Jews. Nevertheless, engagements with these languages played a crucial role in educators' plans to bring campers closer to the lifestyles of Jews from other times and places. None of this stopped. I really love the Yiddish pills part from the title. I feel it needs to be explained. None of this stopped one Hemshekh staff member. I think it's Sam Kazman. Kasman, to wish for a lot more than what the camp had. In 1973, he wrote a story for the camp newspaper, the Hemshekh, right? That's what it was, the Hemshekh, right? About a magical Yiddish pill, which he dreamt would give the campers the ability to speak Yiddish. After the campers took the pills, quote, Michal, the camp director, tests the limits of their vocabulary and finds none. He speaks to other bunks. They all speak Yiddish. They speak it fluently, end quote. A cholam, a dream, a quick fix for the camp, and American Jewry's authenticity problem. Halavai, we should have Yiddish pills out there. Okay, so finally, I'd be remiss not to talk about the role of democratic education, freedom, and leniency in the camp milieu, and point to the power dynamics between staff and campers essential to making the ideologies of camps transferable to the younger generation. Sorry, a bunch of images I didn't get to. Okay. That's you guys? Okay, I don't know where. Sorry, everyone. Okay, I'm going to pause with this image. Okay, we can go back to those images later. Camp leaders incorporated various forms of democracy into the camp schedule and environment, conceiving of their camps as children's republics, miniature democracies. This vision of camping was not unique to Jewish institutions. In fact, American summer camping's leaders, Jewish and Christian alike, enthusiastically adopted this point of view at the turn of the 20th century, inspired by educational philosophers like John Dewey. But while post-war Jewish camps continued this tradition, many also reframed their purposes in doing so, emphasizing how democracy could fit into their broader visions of passing Jewish authenticity on to youth. Hemshekh came to stress democratic practices of Yiddish-speaking socialists, immersing children into their vision of Yiddishism, in part by giving them power and responsibility, like work in the camp environment. So Sarah Rachel pointed out earlier that you would have to clean up the camp after like a particularly messy night, right? That's not just to teach you some sort of Puritan American work ethic, but it's also related to a camp's ideologies, Jewish ideologies. Adapting the model of camp democracy to address the desires of campers for greater freedom and rights within camp, democratic education also shifted in the 60s and 70s as American youth more broadly protested, walked out, and led social change movements. Youth at Yiddish camps increasingly sought to expand their rights at camp and contribute to, if not alter, their camp's ideological landscapes. Through camper councils and assemblies in which elected representatives or the entire camper body took on the task of representing their interests to the staff, educators aimed to bring campers into the decision-making process of everyday life, albeit in controlled and somewhat limited ways. Hemshekh allowed campers to debate and ultimately change the newspaper, for instance, from all Yiddish to half Yiddish and half English, a kind of compromise, and gave campers other opportunities to debate the role of Yiddish and Yiddishism in camp more broadly. And sometimes campers even staged protests, either protesting camp's rules or world events. I have no idea. Anyone know? What's going on here? You know some of the people, but... Hilarious. Okay, so we know who they are, but we don't know what they're protesting, unfortunately. Survival kits sold on remission? Premises? I don't know. They are, right, that's what I think too. They're playing at protests. That's interesting, right? Again, it kind of shows that camp life inherently blurs lines in a way, right, between education, ideology, and play, and that's why it's so effective. Okay, I'm going to move on for time, everyone, but we can keep talking about this a little bit later. So, okay. A camp's influence on youth has to do with many rituals of daily life. But beyond things like camper councils, one of the summer camp's main powers lays in its distinctive incorporation of leniency, freedom, and recreation with ideology and control. These elements helped lead campers to believe that their camp's values were one and the same with their own. It's actually a really crucial part of this power of camp notion, is if you feel free at camp, you also feel that you're taking on the camp's ideologies. willingly. One of the main forms this leniency took was in the realm of dating, romance, and sexuality, all of which played central roles within camper culture. Campers' desires to engage in sexual and romantic relationships challenged leaders to consider what freedoms and privileges campers should have at what ages, especially during the years of the sexual revolution, a time between growing sexual openness on the one hand and a loud condemnation of youth's liberal sexual mores on the other. But camp leaders ultimately found their reasons to allow a romantic and relatively sexually free environment. Giving campers a sense of freedom to pursue what they wished helped reify the idea of camps as environments of free choice, including the choice to adopt Yiddishism as a central element of one's Jewish identity. Sorry, I know everyone's enjoying the pictures, but I can't talk and hear you talk, sorry. Thank you. We're almost done, and then we can chat. So, looking at all of these different aspects of everyday life, what can we say post-war Yiddish cultural camps like Hemshekh and Boybrick achieved? On the one hand, their story is clearly not one of unmitigated success. During the 70s, a new moment in American Jewish history brought a new paradigm of Jewish camping, which began, unfortunately, with many closures. Boybrick and Hemshekh both closed at the end of the 1970s, alongside other legacy Jewish summer camps like the Hebraist Camp Masad and the pioneering Jewish educational camp, Camp Sedgwin. The lingering effects of the 1973-1975 recession, a declining Jewish birth rate, higher operating and insurance costs, and greater competition from travel programs and other camps all plagued the sector. Many camp leaders at the time, however, believed that the financial and demographic forces were only partly to blame. As American Jewry evolved culturally, socioeconomically, and religiously, the leaders of Boybrick and Hemshekh recognized that their specific ideologies had entered a moment of decreasing relevance after decades of Yiddish cultural institutional and linguistic decline. The Jewish educational camps that outlasted the kind of financial difficulties of the 70s demonstrated certain logistical advantages, like strong parent organizations whose funds could help them weather the storm. But camps that survived were also crucially capable of adapting to a changing cultural context with much more ease. Yiddish cultural and left-wing camps, Kinderland and Kindering, for instance, survived the 70s not only because of their ties to the still existing worker circle, I'd argue, but because they had begun the process of decreasing their emphasis on Yiddish decades before. So because history is often written by and for and about the victors, the story of Yiddish camps in the post-war period has largely been ignored by scholars of Jewish education and camping, just as the broader history of Yiddishism in that period has received pretty scant attention. But something was lost in passing over this history. Spoken Yiddish and Yiddish culture undoubtedly declined in the post-war decades, and yet it did not disappear entirely from the American scene. And while they no longer exist today, Boybrick and Hemshekh played crucial roles in the transition Yiddishism took in post-war America, from a European linguistic nationalism based in the vernacular engagement with Yiddish to an American Jewish identity-building tool similar to Zionism and Jewish ritual. As they struggled to turn their fantasies of camps as reconstituted Yiddish lands in the aftermath of the Holocaust into realities, camp leaders not only altered their goals to match their capabilities, camp participants of both generations reconstituted Yiddishism for a new American moment. This new form of Yiddishism that took hold within Camp Hemshekh departed rather dramatically from the movement's initial self-definition in 1908. When attendees of the Chernowitz Conference in 1908 declared Yiddish a national language of the Jewish people, seeking to assert its legitimacy among its own speakers through language planning, standardization, and translating works of high literature. Yiddish's decline as an everyday vernacular, however, required American activists to reimagine Yiddishism's purposes under new social and linguistic conditions, utilizing it as a symbolic framework for immersing youth in a vision of Jewish authenticity. Instead of an everyday spoken language, Yiddish became a way of living at camp, a context for raising children with visions of authenticity. Studying Yiddish camps, I'd argue, also helps to explain how Yiddish cultural and linguistic activism have become meaningful engines for identity for Jewish young people in more recent decades. Rather than emerging suddenly, the so-called Yiddish revival that's been pointed out in the Jewish American press for decades hardly came out of nowhere. Instead, it has relied on the generational chain of cultural keepers, creators, and teachers, many of whom were educated in and inspired by the work of camps like Hemshekh. The intergenerational transformation Yiddishism underwent in these camps towards making it a symbolic tool that infused young Jews with ideas of Jewish culture, social justice, and secularism have thus had a marked impact on Yiddishism's meaning well beyond Hemshekh's closure, one that continues its ripple effects through the current day. Thank you.
We'll take a little bit of time for audience questions, and also I invite those watching online to send their questions in as well.
So first, Shikoach. It's about time somebody focused on the Yiddish camps. Allow me a prologue and an epilogue. Hemshekh initially began its life partly in my living room, my parents' living room. And while they were all Bundists, all of them, they were actually creating the camp in opposition to the leadership of the Bund. Mm. The Bund said, you're wasting your energy, we're not going to get Bundists out of this. And the families that tried to create Hemshekh said, wir wollen nicht verlieren unsere Kinder. We don't want to lose our children. And they wanted to create an environment where there would not be alienation, whether it was linguistic or the centrality of their trauma of Holocaust, or their passion for social justice. They wanted to create an environment where, in opposition to the reigning American ethos, their kids would not feel alienated from them. Mm-hmm. And at least in the initial camp generations, starting in '59, when a lot of the kids spoke Yiddish and the parents were Holocaust survivors, that's exactly what happened. It was an arena of normalcy for these kids who were not normal American kids. Yeah. Later on, it became intergenerational transfer. But the initial impulse wasn't ideological. The initial impulse was very personal. Wir wollen nicht verlieren unsere Kinder. And even in opposition to the Bund leadership, you mentioned Michal. Michal Baran was the most central of the directors of the camp. Michal was a labor Zionist. And the leadership of the Bund was...
Yeah.
And the camp... Yeah, Menucha Zaltzman, but Menucha Zaltzman was part of the Medem Sanatorium, and these people had no notion of kids. Michal Baran was a Yiddish educator. He had good experience in camps. They were more concerned with having someone who understood kids, could bring Yiddish life to life, who had a Havas Yisrael in a very broad sense, as opposed to having an ideological mashgiach at the camp. And that also was a point of contention with the Bundist leadership. Mm-hmm. So it became transfer, but it began as, let's create a bridge between ourselves and our children so America doesn't alienate. And yes, absolutely, a lot of the Hemshekh people then went on to become informers of American Jewish life and creators of other Yiddish institutions and so on and so on. But I think it's important from the ground, and the archives won't reflect that. Mm-hmm. Although the Bund archives might, because there were debates about it. And the original sponsors of Hemshekh was not the Bund, it was Kassettlerverband, the United Survivors of Nazi Persecution. The last point, postscript, I then, at the very end, was on the camp committee. The most telling reason why the camp stopped was not that there weren't kids, there would be kids. There weren't counselors. Because we had all grown up and didn't any longer have the kind of jobs which gave us freedom in the summer. And they said, Stam an ander Camp, wer darf das haben? Okay, okay. And so it wasn't worth the effort just to emulate the other stuff. But sparking these kinds of conversations, Sandra, is extraordinarily important because indeed it's a whole field that has been neglected. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for that. I think what's interesting is I would say that saying we don't want our kids, we want to keep our kids, or we want to, continue this, that is, to me, that is political. Like, I think that it doesn't have to be political with a capital P. It doesn't have to be Bundism, right? Yeah, but it's a different, it's like that personal is political kind of political. Thank you. It's a great comment.
Okay, Elliot touched on something, and I think he'll agree with me. One of the founding principles of the camp was these Holocaust survivors who knew and felt and understood that their children, us, we needed something special. They suffered a trauma, but we had no family.
Yeah.
And they realized how important a place like Camp Hemshekh would be, where we could all be each other's family, because without saying anything, because some of us were quite young and didn't know how to express our feelings, we understood each other. And that's what's different about Camp Hemshekh than any other place, because the founding was with something traumatic and special in mind, different than what anybody else could do.
Yeah.
So you...
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I think that's one of the reasons
Yiddish was important,
right.
But this connection as family,
Yeah.
to supplement what we didn't have and found in each other, was even more important.
That makes so much sense. Thank you for sharing that. And it's one of the reasons that Hemshekh is so unique as well. No another campus like that. Yeah, it's the reason. Well, there's other reasons, I would say, but it's one of the strongest reasons. That's not unique. Yes.
One of the things you mentioned about color war is we had at Hemshekh not just colors, but we were different nations. And that was a very important element.
That was the, Olympiada, right?
But previously we were countries. Up to my generation, the majority of the campers were not born in the United States. So as it was for us a place where we could actually be who we were, because we weren't American. We had come to America, and again, we didn't have families. Most people had their families murdered out. One thing you didn't mention that I thought was interesting is both the parents and the founding group that put Hemshekh together, of course, were immigrants as well. And like those who were from Vilna, also would have been members of the BIN. And the BIN was both a camp, but also education and also politics. One of the most profound elements in terms of our Yiddishkeit was the political element from where we came from. But also when I was 12, I remember having a lecture on the difference between capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism. And years later, when I became a professor and a dean, I had faculty who didn't know the differences. So we came from a split consciousness. We lived, as I did, the constant consciousness of everything we lost, and then the consciousness of what we had to do to appear American. So Hemshekh gave us both the ability to be with people we didn't have to explain who we were. Nobody I went to school with understood who I was profoundly. And in Hemshekh, I didn't have to explain, and we did talk about it. So part of the experience was not just activism, it was also identity and the preservation of the memory, which is very important. And of course, in Judaism, memory is essential, Tikkun Olam is essential, and Hemshekh, I never found another place that was so immersed in humanism and ethical approach to life and behavior. It was, I think for some of us, like myself, it was a life-saving place where my authentic self could exist as I learned to perform my American self.
That's really, thank you so much for articulating that. And while very different, I think also that was sort of the point of the first Jewish summer camps that were created for the immigrants and children of immigrants. Obviously, different generational period, but that exact thing of somewhere where they could just be themselves while also figuring out how to be American. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I just wanted to add to what some of what was said. First of all, her talking about it. What Fagel just said reminded me that in the mid-1970s in the Hemshekh Vach, there was an article written by somebody named Shlomo Singer called "Sex and Socialism." The entire article was about socialism, and at the end it said more about sex in the next issue.
Brilliant. The Hemshekh Vach was also the funniest camper newspaper I found.
Yeah.
Really, it was really funny.
Yeah. Elia had mentioned that at the end that it closed not because of dearth of campers, but because of dearth of counselors. I think I'm the only person here of the Hemshekhistim that are here that was a camper in the 1970s right up to the year that it closed. And so I remember that around 1973-4, there were 125 campers, and by 1978, it was down to 70.
Yeah.
So I do believe that while the dearth of counselors may have indeed been important, a dearth of campers as well. And quite a few of the campers that came in the last year were Russian immigrants who were being paid for because they couldn't afford it. So I think of the 70 campers, maybe 50 were paying.
Yeah.
So there definitely was a dearth of that. I also, I spoke to Eve before, and when I saw her a few weeks ago, I remembered an anecdote from a culture night at Camp Hemshekh. I thought that her husband, Moish Russ, wrote it, but he doesn't remember it. It was about Avram Reisen. And every Friday night there was a culture night. That was also something that was different. Other camps had Friday nights that were Shabbos-oriented or Israel-oriented. That was our Shabbos, right. And I remember one particular play was about Avram Reisen, and the character of Avram Reisen was on stage, and he was bemoaning the fact that nobody knew who he was. They might have known his poems, but they didn't know who he was. And so somebody came on stage and said, "Aren't you a famous Yiddish poet?" And he said, "Yes." And then they said, "Isn't your name the name of a dried fruit?" And he said, "Yes, yes." And she said, "Prune, piña prune." That was the kind of thing, that was the kind of plays that Moish Rosenfeld wrote for a while, and then Moish Russ. They did wonderful jobs of making Yiddish writers and Yiddish culture appealing in English to a modern audience who knew little about them, especially in the last years of Hemshekh.
That's really funny. Thank you.
Just to add about Yiddish writers, there was one cultural weekend where Yankiv Glatschein, who is a brilliant modernist Yiddish poet, came to Hemshekh. And as I drove him to the bus, he said to me in Yiddish, "Wer wird sich gecholemt, als mein Ticken wird kommen von einer bundischen Sommerlager?" Who would have imagined that my sense of wholeness would come from a Bundes camp? But that was the one place where he was appreciated.
Maybe we'll take one last question, and then we can continue the conversation out in the hall with a light. Nosh.
Thank you. Well, first, it's been really wonderful to listen to this talk with the context of the lived subject matter experience here and seeing all your reactions. So thank you for that. Two things that you said that I have two quick questions about. One, you mentioned towards the end of the talk the ways in which certain summer camps, by virtue of losing their Yiddish identity, were able to sort of remain intact. And I have a number of friends that went to Camp Kindering, which is one that you mentioned. So interested to sort of hear, more the larger sort of context for what was happening there. And maybe the answer is it's in my book. The other question I had, thinking about Yiddish in the summer camp experience today, I live in South Williamsburg, and so I sort of wonder whether the current sort of iteration of Jewish summer camps that exists in certain Hasidic communities in upstate New York have in fact drawn on anything from the Jewish, either secular or Yiddish summer camp experiences in modeling what that sort of reinvented Jewish camping experience looks like in the Hasidic tradition.
Great questions. To answer your last question, I don't think so. I think that I didn't study so much Hasidic summer camping because that started after the period that my book covers, but in terms of even just regular Orthodox summer camping, for the most part, because Orthodox Jews go to Jewish day school during the year and their life is just inherently Jewish all the time by virtue of their Jewish practice, the camps could actually kind of be a little bit more recreational. There are exceptions to that rule, but generally a lot of Orthodox camps are mostly recreational, and then they just make sure the halachic obligations are met. And so Hasidic camps, I think they do have educational aspects, but again, those kids are immersed in that all year long, so the urgency to make it happen during the camp summer months is like maybe a little bit less there. Your other question was, remind me? Oh, Kindering, yeah. I wish I knew more. They don't have great archives. What I've gathered is that because Kindering and Kinderland had these other ideologies and the kind of the parent organizations behind them with their purposes, when Yiddish declined, it was easier to go with the other purposes than it would have been for Boyberick, for instance, which was primarily a Yiddish cultural organization. It didn't have such political or kind of organizational or ideological framing. And then Hemshekh, as I described, and also how people who went there described it, it had, kind of the dual thing of continuing Yiddish and also being a place for children of survivors. And so it could not as easily kind of reinvent itself in the face of Yiddish decline. I think what you're saying, Benjamin, about the declining number of campers, I think it's both things are true, right? If counselors are not, if there are no more counselors, it's not just because the older ones grew out of it and have jobs now. It means that at some point the campers stop becoming counselors. That's how that's kind of the chain that's supposed to continue. So something happened, right? And I think what happened was, as you all described, and as it's kind of described in my book, the population of Hemshekh changes, and there isn't kind of this basis of more Yiddish-oriented or learned counselors to continue it. So I think that those camps just had an easier time reinventing themselves. I wonder, because I don't know, I've heard a little bit about this, but as Yiddish has become popular and cool in the last, decade or so, like do Kinderland and Kindering use Yiddish more? Is there some way in which the trajectory is changing again? I don't have an answer to that. Maybe I'll look at it in several decades from now. But thanks for the question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.